There are outboards you'll never see in headlines or public recall lists, but every mechanic has a story about one. The motor that comes in, still warm from a perfect test ride, and won't idle the next morning. The spotless cowling hiding salt, storage, and shortcuts. The one no shop wants to touch, unless you agree to a very different labor rate. So today, 4 outboard brands to avoid at all cost. And 4 brands that are actually worth buying. Because in boating, engines don't just fail when they break. They fail when parts, support, and resale disappear. And we're starting with a brand that can feel like the best upgrade of your life until the support you assumed existed doesn't. Number 4, 7 Marine. It usually begins with a promise that feels too fun to ignore. The seller talks about power like it is reliability. The rigging looks clean, the boat sits tall, and the whole package gives you that feeling that you are not just buying an engine, you are buying an identity. You can almost hear the dock talk before you even launch. Then you learn what this kind of ownership actually means. This is a brand that lives in the boutique, ultra-high horsepower world, where the support network is part of the product. That is not an insult. It is a contract. The problem is that the used market rarely tells you what the previous owner signed, and it rarely tells you how many people in your area can actually honor that contract when something small stops being small. The trap is not that it cannot be amazing. The trap is that it can be amazing right up until the first time it needs something that is not routine. And on engines like this, routine is already different. Even basic questions: who rigs it cleanly? Who stocks the service items that you do not see until you need them? Who knows the platform well enough to diagnose without guessing matter more than buyers expect? This is how people get burned. The demonstration is strong, the idle is confident, the throttle response feels sharp. The buyer tells themselves, if it runs like this today, I am safe. But the domino rarely begins with a dramatic failure. It begins with time. A component fails, and the part is not sitting on a shelf. A specialist technician is booked out. The boat sits, not because the issue is impossible, but because the ecosystem is smaller. And when the season is short, time becomes expensive. There is also a long horizon worry that sneaks in quietly. Insurance, resale financing, even basic buyer confidence can shift when a platform is perceived as harder to support. In boating, confidence is value. When confidence fades, value follows, even if nothing is technically wrong with your motor. A grounded buyer does not buy this brand on hype or on a clean test run. They buy proof, a confirmed servicing specialist in reasonable distance, a parts pathway that is real, and a clear understanding of what normal ownership costs look like, not the best case stories, the normal ones. If you cannot verify that before money changes hands, this becomes a stressful kind of maybe, and maybe is not what you want on the back of a boat you plan to trust. When ownership depends on a small support world, every small issue becomes louder. But there's another kind of problem that hits even strong engines, when the motor itself can be great, yet the pathway to keep it great becomes uncertain. That shift catches buyers off guard. Number 3, Evinrude. It often starts with a feeling that the motor is different in a way you cannot fully explain. The torque delivery feels memorable. The boat responds in a way that makes owners speak with loyalty instead of just satisfaction. And the seller usually leans into that story because they have heard it before. These things are beasts when they are right. That can be true, and the risk can still be true. The risk lies in the gap between does it run and what happens when it does not run perfectly. On modern, software-driven outboards, the domino rarely begins with something cinematic. It begins with something technical that feels fixable. A fault code appears once and then clears. A limp behavior shows up only after a long run. A sensor reading is technically within range, but not quite normal. You cannot always hear it. You cannot always see it. You just feel the motor acting slightly different than it should. In a strong support region, that is not a crisis. It is an appointment, a scan, a part, and you are back on the water. In a thin support region, the exact same symptom becomes something else entirely. Wait lists, phone calls, shipping delays, and the quiet realization that not every technician wants to be the one responsible for your outcome. Even if the fix is straightforward, the path to the fix can be longer than buyers expect. The worst part is what it does to trust. You stop enjoying your runs and start listening for clues. You plan trips around the ramp. You hesitate to take the boat far from easy help, not because you expect disaster, but because you can feel that the cost of uncertainty is higher when the solution pathway is unclear. Then, there is the resale shadow that buyers often misunderstand. Even if your engine is flawless, buyers do not only pay for performance, they pay for confidence. If your market has fewer technicians comfortable with the platform, buyers price that in before they ask about top speed. They ask who will service it before they ask, what does it run? A grounded buyer does not accept vague reassurance here. They want believable service history, not just, it has always been great. They want a true cold start, not a warmed-up demonstration. They want a sea trial under sustained load long enough to prove stable behavior. And they want to know clearly who can scan and service it locally. Without that, you are not buying an engine problem. You are buying a calendar problem. The scary part isn't one fault code. It's what fault codes do to your planning. You start boating like you're borrowing time. And the next brand on this list doesn't even need software drama to ruin a season. Its risk is older, simpler, and painfully common. Number 2, force. This one often comes attached to the boat like it is a bonus. The listing treats it like a throw-in. The seller says it runs strong, starts easy, and just needs to be used. And because the price feels low enough, buyers convince themselves it is a stepping stone, a temporary season, an easy way into boating. Then, the stepping stone becomes a sinkhole. The trap here is not that every example is doomed. The trap is that the average used example tends to come with the kind of history you cannot see at idle. These motors are frequently found on boats that changed hands quickly, which means problems do not always get solved, they get passed along. Maintenance gets delayed, then forgotten, then replaced by optimism. The cowling stays clean while the story underneath becomes a patchwork. This is how buyers get burned. The motor starts and idles, maybe even sounds crisp in neutral, but under real load, the truth begins to show. Cooling health that is good enough at idle stops being good enough on a long run. Fuel delivery issues hide until you push mid-range and hold it. Ignition inconsistencies come and go, just long enough to make you chase easy fixes that change the symptom without curing the cause. And that is where money drains away. Not always because the fix is impossible, but because the path to the fix can become a long sequence of maybe it is this, and try that, and it ran fine on the hose. The boat becomes a project you did not plan for. Even when the motor can be repaired, ownership can become exhausting because you are constantly deciding how much you want to invest in a platform with unknown history and uneven support. A grounded buyer does not buy this on "it ran last weekend." They buy it only on boring proof, compression numbers that support the story, evidence of recent cooling system care, and a run under sustained load long enough to prove stable temperature and stable behavior. If you cannot get that, you are not buying cheap boating, you are buying expensive uncertainty. When a motor's history is a patchwork, you don't get one clear failure, you get a long series of guesses. And now comes the entry people underestimate most, because it looks harmless, the kind of engine buyers treat like it can't possibly ruin anything. Quick pause. If this breakdown feels different than the usual brand wars, hit like and subscribe. It tells the algorithm there's room for outboard talk that's actually useful. What fails, how it fails, and what it costs in time, not just money. And I want your help sharpening this list. What's the one brand in your area that keeps showing up with the same mystery problem every season? Not rumors, not my cousin said. What you've personally seen. What was the symptom, and when did it show? Up cold start, mid-range, hot restart. Long run? The patterns matter, because the used market repeats itself. Your comment might save someone from buying next weekend's headache. Number 1, Hankai. It usually begins the way bad buys often begin, with a feeling that this cannot possibly matter that much. The motor is small, the plan is simple. It is just a kicker, or just a backup, or just for short runs. The price looks impossible, the photos look clean, and the seller's confidence feels contagious. That is where the trap hides. Small outboards do not ruin seasons because they explode. They ruin seasons because they create false confidence. A backup motor is meant to reduce anxiety, but if the backup is the engine you trust least, it does the opposite. It becomes something you carry, not something you believe in. The problem is not only whether it can run, the problem is what happens when something small goes wrong and you need support. With a supported portable from a major manufacturer, you are buying more than metal and horsepower. You are buying parts diagrams, predictable supplies, technicians who have seen the platform, and a pathway to solve small issues quickly. With this brand, that pathway can be thin. The domino starts exactly the way people do not take seriously. a fuel delivery quirk, a linkage adjustment that will not stay put, a cooling concern that appears under load instead of in a barrel demonstration. Nothing dramatic, nothing that gets caught in a quick test. And then the real problem shows up. Parts access becomes the bottleneck, or the local shops do not want the job, or you find yourself waiting weeks for a component that is not stocked nearby while summer slips away. Even if you are mechanically capable, you can still lose time. And in boating, time is not just time. It is weather windows, planned trips, weekends you cannot get back. That is the cost buyers do not calculate when they tell themselves it is only a small motor. A grounded buyer avoids this unless they can verify real documentation, real parts access, and a local service path that does not depend on luck. If you cannot point to that before purchase, cheap becomes the most expensive kind of cheap, the one you cannot fix quickly when it matters. Now we flip the script, because avoiding bad buys is only half the game. The other half is what most people skip: learning which brands tend to keep your problems small, your downtime short, and your confidence intact once the honeymoon ends. Not because they never fail, and not because the badge guarantees anything, but because the world around them is real. Parts that show up, service information that exists, technicians who don't hesitate, patterns that have been solved before you even walk into the shop. This is where the used market stops being about the cleanest cowling and starts being about the clearest pathway back to the water. Because the best used outboard is rarely the one that looks perfect on day one. It's the one that stays fixable on day 90, when the first small clue appears and you need answers fast. Number 4. Tohatsu. It often feels like an insider pick, the kind of badge you hear about quietly instead of loudly. Owners mention it in passing. Dealers nod instead of arguing. And when you see enough boats over enough seasons, you notice a pattern. The people running these motors are not always the ones seeking attention. They are the ones seeking calm. And what makes this brand worth it is not that it never has issues. It is that the issues are less likely to turn into mysteries. The service pathway tends to be clearer. Parts and procedures tend to be easier to match to the problem. The platform often behaves in a way that rewards normal ownership instead of punishing small mistakes with long downtime. This is why it performs so well as a used buy. It fits real life. Real life is storage. Real life is fuel that sits longer than it should. Real life is trips that turn into long runs. Real life is owners who are not perfect. A used outboard that can tolerate real life without becoming a constant puzzle has value that does not show up in the listing description. And there is also a psychological advantage that buyers underestimate. When you know the solution pathway exists, you enjoy the engine more. You stop listening for every tiny change. You stop planning your trips around what if. Confidence returns, and confidence is the hidden spec that makes boating feel like boating again. A grounded buyer still buys on proof, true cold start, service history that makes sense, and a sea trial under sustained load long enough to confirm stable behavior. But when you pick a brand like this, you are often buying into an ownership story that stays calmer than the alternatives. When you buy into calm ownership, you stop chasing ghosts and start boating again. But now we're going back to the big engine world, where the used market is louder, the stakes are higher, and the real advantage isn't performance, it's ecosystem. Number 3, Mercury. It is easy to focus on the badge and miss the larger advantage sitting behind it, because the real reason this brand works as a used buy is not a single feature. It is scale. It is the number of technicians who have seen the same symptoms before. It is the number of parts suppliers who stock common components without drama. It is the simple fact that when a platform is common, the path from problem to solution tends to be shorter. That matters because used outboards rarely fail in dramatic ways. They fail in clues. A hesitation that appears only at a certain throttle angle. A stumble that comes and goes. A warning tone that happens once and then disappears during inspection. The kind of symptoms that drain money, not because they are unsolvable, but because they are slippery. With a broadly supported brand, those slippery problems are less likely to become long investigations. Someone has seen it. Someone has a process. Someone has a tool that reads what the engine remembers. And when that happens, ownership stays practical instead of emotional. This is not permission to buy blindly. This is the exact kind of brand where buyers get careless because the name feels like a guarantee. A grounded buyer still demands proof. Believable service records, true cold start, sea trial under sustained load, stable temperatures, and scan information when available that matches the seller's narrative instead of contradicting it. But when all of that checks out, the used market advantage is real. You are buying not just a motor, but a support world that can turn a mid-season issue into a short repair instead of a season-ending wait. A widely supported motor is easier to keep moving, but not every buyer wants easier. Some want quiet. The next badge has built a reputation around that idea, and the reason it lands so high is not hype, it's how often it fades into the background. Number 2, Yamaha. Most buyers approach this name with confidence. And that confidence is not random. You see it in rigging choices. You see it in how many boats are built around the assumption that the motor will simply behave. And you see it in how often people choose it, because they want to stop thinking about the motor. That is where the real value lives. Predictability. Used outboards are risky when history is unclear, and history is often unclear. Saltwater environments, long storage periods, inconsistent maintenance habits do not always show themselves in a quick dock test. A motor can idle smoothly, while subtle issues build quietly in the background. That is why a brand's ecosystem matters. Technician familiarity, parts availability, and common repair pathways turn unknown history into something you can actually manage. With this brand, the path tends to be clearer. Patterns are well known. Common issues are not mysteries. And when you buy a platform that many skilled people have serviced for years, you reduce the odds that a small symptom becomes a long, expensive story. The grounded buyer still does not buy on optimism. They ask for documentation that feels boring, consistent service, evidence of cooling system maintenance, clean oil habits, and a sea trial under sustained load long enough to confirm stable temperature and stable behavior. They insist on a true cold start, not a warmed-up demonstration. They listen for confidence, not theatrics. When those boxes are checked, this is the kind of used buy that tends to keep boating simple. And in the used market, simple is a luxury. A strong brand doesn't eliminate risk. It reduces the cost of being wrong. And the last outboard on our list earns the top spot because it often keeps problems practical. When something small goes off, the pathway back to the water usually stays clear. And that's the point. Number 1, Suzuki. It usually becomes a favorite in a quiet way. People do not always brag about it. They just keep running it. You see the same boats still launching season after season, the same owners still taking longer runs without doing mental math about the nearest ramp. The story is not always perfect, but it is often steady. And in boating, steady is not boring. Steady is freedom. It is the difference between planning trips around weather and planning trips around failure. That steadiness is the value. The advantage here is not just performance. It is strong mid-range power, efficient cruising, and an ownership path that stays practical. When something small goes wrong, you are less likely to rely on luck. Parts are easier to source, and more technicians already know the platform. That changes ownership. You stop listening for tiny changes and turning every run into a mental checklist. Because most used outboards do not fail dramatically. They fail in clues: a rougher start, a small hesitation after idling, a temperature that creeps up on a hot day. On a well-supported platform, those clues are more likely to lead to a clean diagnosis instead of weeks of guessing. That is what separates good engines from good used buys. A good used buy is not the engine that never has a problem. It is the engine that does not turn small problems into big downtime, because downtime is what steals seasons. Downtime is what turns boating into phone calls. Downtime is what makes people sell the boat out of frustration, not because they stopped loving the water, but because they got tired of waiting. A grounded buyer still demands proof. They want service receipts that support the story. They want a true cold start, not a warmed-up demonstration. They want a sea trial under sustained load long enough to show stable temperature and stable behavior, and an engine that does not need excuses when it is asked to work. They also pay attention to the boring details: clean rigging, sensible fuel filtration, and signs that the previous owner treated maintenance as routine instead of optional. And when that proof is there, this is often one of the smartest ways to buy confidence used. Confidence that you can run farther, plan more, and spend less time interpreting clues that should have been solved quickly. If this list helped you dodge a bad decision, hit like and subscribe, because this space moves fast, and we're covering the changes as they happen. Real-world experience makes these lists stronger. So drop a comment. What engine burns people most in your area? What failure actually happened? Not rumors, real examples. Your story might be the one that helps someone else make a better choice. The most expensive motor isn't always the broken one. It's the one with unknown history, thin support, and small problems that turn into lost weekends.